In this lecture, we'll be looking into pre-Islamic Arabia. But before we continue further into our discussion, it's important to understand that the literary material available from this period is very scarce. And the material history sources that can broaden our understanding is still limited and needs years of archaeological work. The diversity of the cultures and society that existed in the pre-Islamic Arabia and the spread of diverse geography is also another limit to have a comprehensive survey of the subject, especially in 15 minutes. So with these limits in mind, I would like to first start talking about the society and the social structure in the pre-Islamic Arabia. With certain exceptions, almost all of the inhabitants of pre-Islamic Arabia were members of a tribe, an interconnected kinship group that has mutual aid as their purpose. Unlike institutions like states of modern or pre-modern times, tribes have no specialized institutions to establish law and order. The idea is that an individual relies on the other members of the tribe for protection of their life, goods, and honor. The tribes are obliged to take revenge or seek for compensation for any wrongdoings directed towards their members. This was a measure that provided a certain level of peaceful coexistence, coupled with other measures that limited the use of force, such as exogamy, communal ceremonies, religion, code of hospitality. Some tribes had strong codes of customs to regulate their affairs, as it is the case with most pastoral tribes who relied on these traditions for survival. These customs were inherently conservative, and updating these codes needed the consensus of the whole tribe. Pre-Islamic Arab poet Ladib says for his tribe that it is one of a tribe whose forefathers laid down for them a sunnah, and every folk has a sunnah and its imam. Sunnah and imam, which also become Islamic concepts, here mean established customary practices for sunnah and tribal heroes for imam, respectively. So the legal structure was highly customary and depended on the society to self-regulate. In case if a member of the tribe committed a crime against his own, they could be punished by excommunication, and the person's protection by the tribe was revoked. Among the wealthiest sedentary polities of Arabia, like in down south, there existed a more elaborate legal system with more of an institutional framework. They had councils, popular assemblies, and an elected king who's more of a manager than a sovereign. And all these had slightly more of a central control and institutional legal structure. Tribes were structured in multiple levels. Pretty much each level had its own set of responsibilities. The local community takes care of day-to-day labors, the production of sustenance, goods, basic handicrafts, the rearing of the young, and the others. More general matters were handled at higher levels, and in the case of situations that required a collective response, like drought, epidemics, crop failure, war, the whole tribe may need to come together to combat the challenge. The relation between the tribes and amongst the subunits differed depending on the level of hierarchy. Within the smaller subunits, such as family or clan, conflict needed to be speedily dealt with, for that it posed a threat of breaking up the group and disrupt the access to the resources. But at the next level of units, there was no such urgency, as the units occupied generally different geographical spaces, so they didn't have any access to themselves all the time. At the tribal level, intertribal rivalries and feuds could have lasted for decades with no member of the tribe remembering the actual reason for the rivalry. Although when we think of the Arabian Peninsula, we imagine desolate deserts with caravans of camels. But the agriculture was a great source of income for certain parts, especially down south. This caused the development of society in different ways. The lack of permanent rivers and limited rainfall required careful management of water. Also, the production cycle and the needs of the agriculture led to development of division of labor in these regions. However, the pastoral tribes generally lacked this division of labor, and specialization was something left to the slaves of the tribe. Certainly, the type of pastoralism had an impact on the level of division of labor. The agro-pastoral tribes of the South Levant and the southern parts of the peninsula involved in growing field crops and raised small livestock, and they had a higher level of division of labor compared to the transhumans who moved depending on the seasons, and the completely nomadic pastorals. The most significant advance in pastoralism for Arabia was the domestication of the one-humped camel, a process that was probably began in the southeast Arabia in the 3rd millennium BCE. It was very likely exploited first for its dung, and then its milk and flesh, and at the end of the process would come to its use for riding and transport. The ability of the camel to travel without water for up to a month and capability to carry heavy loads allowed Arab pastoralists to penetrate much further into the interior of Arabia. Other than agriculture and pastoralism, trade was an important economic activity. Until the spread of Christianity in Rome, the frankincense and myrrh trade was a prominent source of income. But this trade slowly declined as the Christians wanted to distance their practices from the pagan practices and gave up on using frankincense and myrrh in high quantities. Although this local trade died, the position of Arabia between Mediterranean world, Mesopotamia, Africa and India meant that it was a hub for transit trade. And as long as the political and economic conditions permitted, there were Arab merchants who were eager to trade. Unlike our imagination of caravans with hundreds of camels, it was mostly small-time trade with a merchant only owning 1 or 2 camel loads of goods. Also, there was local trade, especially between the sedentary and the nomadic groups who exchanged goods that are originated and destined for consumption in Arabia. Up until the 4th century Common Era, almost all the inhabitants of Arabia were polytheists. We know many of the names of their deities. Since the most common aim of the Arabian inscriptions was to invoke the gods in some ways, usually petitioning them or thanking them, and they also frequently used assigned epithets to these gods, but we don't necessarily know the stories and the background of these gods. The south had the most developed pantheon in Arabia, with 100 deities roughly. The southern gods did not have particular functions, but had spheres of operation. Like there was no god that was controlling the climate, but there was a god who was in charge of a certain location, and then the climate in that location was in that god's control. So southern gods were mostly tied to geography. Sabaeans, Dominians, Katabians, and Hadramites had their own patron gods, and they were Each was collectively termed the children of their respective patron deity. In less complex societies than South Arabia, the pantheon might be much smaller, and the patron deity might assume a particularly prominent place. And the cosmopolitan areas like Palmyra had a great mix of religions and gods. At another structural level, there were numerous tutelary deities who protected the villages, families, and individuals. In southern Arabia, there were anonymous guardians of local community. And in North Arabia, there were beings referred to as Ginaya. And these are probably related to the jinn, who feature in accounts of the West and Central Arabia. And their traces can be found in Islamic tradition. In the northwest of Arabian Peninsula, there was a very ancient Jewish community. And in South Arabia, inscriptions in the 4th century AD, we see a change in the religious outlook of at least the ruling elite. References to pagan deities of the ancient tradition disappeared almost completely in favor of mention of one unique god, and referred to as the merciful, or simply as God. From the mid-5th century, East Rome promoted Christianity in South Arabia, chiefly via its ally Ethiopia, which sparked off violent clashes with the advocates of the Judaism down south. But it was particularly the inhabitants of North Arabia who were won over to Christianity in large numbers in this period. So in this lecture, we learned about the society, the economic structure, and religions of pre-Islamic Arabia. And hopefully, now we have some understanding of the context which Islam was born into. And in the next lecture, we're going to be looking at the formative years of Islam.